record will reflect the presence of members of the jury, and you may be seated. Do you understand your responsibility?
Yes, I do.
You may continue with your examination.
Thank you. Now, Ms. Kashimoto, I want to step back a little bit and ask you some general questions with respect to DNA. And I had asked you earlier, where can DNA be found? The other general question I wanted to ask you is what makes DNA unique? Can you explain that?
So for DNA, one of the important things about it is that it's inherited from our parents, meaning half of our DNA is obtained from our mother and half of our DNA is obtained from our father. So this is helpful when we're examining DNA profiles. It helps us because we know what to expect as far as a single source profile. So you either expect to see one or two genetic characteristics at each genetic location because the DNA is inherited from our parents. So we get one characteristic from our mother, one from our father. If that characteristic happens to be the same at that genetic location, you'll see one number. If it's different, you'll see two numbers.
And this might be a real basic question, but the way you distinguish or what identifies the genetic locations are by numbers, is that correct?
It's an alphanumeric designation.
And getting back to right before the break, you had testified that, I guess the report dated March 3rd of 2014, you testified earlier that included swabs from the bra, swabs from nails marked distal and proximal, a toothbrush that was labeled as being a personal effect of Carly Scott, and tissue from a lower right jawbone, number 2. Were that all the items?
Yes.
For that report?
Yes.
When did you receive those items?
So I received those items February 24th, 2014.
And let's further discuss that. Discuss the items. I think we left off on the 4 swabs from the bra, and 2 were marked as R, and the other 2 were marked as L with 1 LV number. Is that correct?
Yes.
Did you prepare a table that would assist you in explaining, I guess, the results from your DNA testing?
I believe the table we have shows some of the DNA profiles, but not everything.
Right, in preparation for your testimony here at trial, did you prepare a subsequent table that would have shown the profiles of these specific items that you tested in your report dated March 3rd, 2014?
Yeah, so part of our report, we include the tables of the DNA profiles that we've tested.
And the other table would just show the results?
The one that's going to be presented here, I'm sorry.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. Would the table that shows the results help you in explaining what the results were to the ladies and gentlemen?
I believe that from this report on that table, there should be 2 items that I could help. I could explain to them. Okay.
And the other, showing counsel what has been marked as case exhibit 435 for identification. May I approach Ms. Hashimoto with this?
You may do so.
You know, may I approach?
Yes.
Okay, Ms. Hashimoto, I'm sure you would have been marked for identification as case exhibit 435. If you could please take a look at that. Can you recognize that?
Yes, so this is basically a summary table of all the items I tested, and it's broken down by the report number and the specific items and the results.
Would that assist you in explaining, I guess, the summary and results of your testing of all of the items that you would have received from the Maui Police Department in this case?
Yes,
And does that table accurately reflect the information you just described, all of the, I guess, the summary and the results of all the items that you did test?
so the summary of the results were taken directly from my reports that I issued.
Have they been changed or altered in any way?
Not that I can see. It looks accurate.
And did you yourself prepare that though?
Yes, I did.
Your Honor, based on that, the state would move into evidence State's Exhibit 435, which has been marked for identification.
Mr. Marty?
I do have objection to at least part of it. Maybe if we can approach.
Yes. Subject to what was discussed at the bench, I'll allow you, I'm assuming you're going to be asking me to publish.
I'm going to ask to publish a portion of that exhibit, the first page.
Subject to our discussion, I'll allow that to occur.
So, Ms. Kashimoto, I'm going to refer you, if you can, better maybe Ms. Kashimoto sit down the portion.
Yes, absolutely.
And Ms. Kashimoto, I'm going to refer you to, yes, the 6-inch monitor. If you could stand to the far right of the monitor so the ladies and gentlemen in the corner can see this. And I'm just going to show you each one with the top table health prepared. And I'm just going to block out the rest that we haven't got into yet. Just a second. No, it's not. Can you see that clear, Ms. Kashimoto?
Yes.
Okay. Well, you previously testified that, that with respect to the swabs, the 4 swabs from the bra, no profile was obtained. Is that noted there?
Yes, it is.
Okay, and can you, there's a pointer right behind you leaning against the wall. If you could just point that out for us here.
Okay, so this table is representing the evidence that I examined, the first report. That's the report dated March 3rd, 2014. Included in this table are the description, which is here. This control number is indicating that unique identifier that we were speaking about earlier. If there was blood testing, it has the results. If there was none, there's an NA. And then the DNA results are in this last column here.
Now, going to your testimony with respect to the 10 swabs from the nails marked distal and 10 swabs from the nails marked proximal, can you explain how you went, starting with the 10 swabs from nails marked distal, can you explain how you went about testing those?
So there was 10 swabs, so a portion of each of the swabs was sampled, and that was taken through the DNA process. The DNA typing results are listed here. It was actually, part of the profile was at the low level. When I made the comparison against the toothbrush that was listed as a personal effect of Carly Scott, my conclusion is here. So Carly Scott cannot be excluded as the source of the DNA profile obtained from those 10 swabs from the nails marked distal.
And just to get a little more specific, can you explain how were you able to get a DNA profile from those 10 swabs? So what did you do?
So again, I went through the DNA process of extracting the sample, quantitating the sample, amplifying it, and then typing it. But the end result is a DNA profile. At that point, I'll evaluate the profile and make comparisons to any reference or known samples that I have. At this time, I had the toothbrush, which is listed as the alleged DNA profile of Carly Scott. Again, that was a personal effect. So I made a comparison against that profile from the toothbrush to the profile obtained from the 10 swabs from the nails marked distal.
And your conclusion was cannot be excluded, is that correct?
Correct.
And what did you mean when you said cannot be excluded?
So I evaluate the profile, make a comparison to the known sample. I'm referring to the alleged DNA profile of Carly Scott the toothbrush, I'm referring to that as a no now. So I'll make a comparison, evaluate at all the 15 different locations and determine whether or not there's consistency between the question and the no.
Now, of the 15 different locations, how many locations did you, I guess, how many locations were you able to compare with respect to the 10 swabs from the nails mark pistol? How many compared?
There was 14 out of 15. The 15th genetic location was at a low level.
And just as a hypothesis, if it were 15 out of 15, would you have put cannot be excluded? And it wasn't on a level?
So for a single source profile, if there's a 15 out of 15, I want to say it's called, we call it concordance, meaning if there's a consistency between the question and the no, the conclusion would have been match instead of cannot be excluded.
But you got 14 out of 15 because of the low level of one of the locations.
Correct?
Even though you got 14 out of 15, were you still able to apply the frequency estimate with respect to those findings?
Yes. So since I had an association made, which is the cannot be excluded, I performed the frequency estimates on that sample.
And how's that performed? How's
So
that?
we input the profile into that software program called POSTAS, which is provided by the FBI.
And what numbers did you arrive at?
So ultimately, the frequency estimate was determined to be, can I refer to my report?
Sure.
So I can read it. So I'm referring, so actually, the way we word it, I want to make sure I phrase it correctly. So it would be using the most conservative frequency estimate calculated. In this case, it was Caucasian. Approximately 2.259 quadrillion unrelated individuals would have to be evaluated before expecting to find an individual with that DNA profile, or that could not be excluded from that DNA profile.
So before, I guess, you would have Charlie Scott, and before there's another person that would have that same DNA profile of what is, I guess, the alleged DNA profile of Charlie Scott, you'd have to go through 2.259 quadrillion individuals?
So I wouldn't phrase it as another individual. It's just
Or-
in general, you would expect to have to evaluate that many individuals before finding someone who had a DNA profile who could not be excluded from that profile.
Okay. And so with these numbers, though, you, according to your standards, though, you cannot put it's a match, although these numbers are that high?
No.
With respect to the number here, 2.259 quadrillion, is that reflected on page 205 of your issue report dated March 3rd, 2014?
So actually, the frequency estimate was recalculated in the
Okay.
subsequent report.
Mhm.
I don't know if we
So
can-
is that why that's a different number?
Yes. So it's in the subsequent report, there's an update to the frequency estimate.
What, can you just give us a number? What did you have in your first report?
So I'm referring to page 2 of the report issued dated March 3rd, 2014. The number was 2.327 quadrillion.
And then you said you did an update and the number has changed.
Excuse me?
You did an update to that report?
The frequency estimate was recalculated in a subsequent report, and that has to do with a statement that was issued by the FBI.
And is that how you arrived at that number?
So the number on the table is reflected on the report dated September 9th, 2015.
And as you sit there, actually, does that affect your conclusions?
No, the frequency estimate number would not affect my conclusion. So my conclusion is still as listed, where she could not be excluded, or Carly Scott could not be excluded from that profile.
Okay. Now, you also testified that you, did a DNA test on the question 10 swabs from Nils Mark proximal, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, and can you tell us what were the results of that?
So for the 10 swabs from the nails mark proximal, there was no interpretable DNA profile obtained. And what that means is that there may have been a few DNA characteristics, but it was too low and too few to really do anything with it.
And you've already testified with respect to the toothbrush, you were able to get a DNA profile from the toothbrush that the alleged profile of Charlie Scott, is that correct?
The DNA profile was obtained from the toothbrush.
Now, turning your attention to the tissue from the lower right jawbone, number 2, could you tell us how you went about testing that?
So as I recall, there was 4 pieces of tissue that were submitted for testing. I took approximately half of each of those 4 pieces and took that through the DNA process. There was no DNA profile obtained, so there was no comparisons or conclusions done on that.
Okay, and as far as for testing of blood, this is N/A, is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, so that you didn't perform any blood tests on the, I guess the tissue taken from the right jawbone.
Correct. So N/A indicates not applicable, so it means it wasn't done in those samples.
Now, Ms. Cachino, did you feel you had a sufficient amount of, I guess, material or tissue from the lower right jawbone for testing?
Well, we never know, but we're limited on how much we can sample. So it's our policy that we will not sample more than half of any piece of evidence, and we do that for several reasons. The biggest reason is in case additional testing needs to be done, we want to have additional sample left for that testing.
And when you say no profile obtained, based on your training, your experience, as well as your education, are there reasons why the DNA profile could not be obtained from human tissue?
So if it was a known piece of human tissue and we didn't get a result, the possibilities are that it was degraded to a point where our tests weren't able to detect any DNA in it.
And you testified earlier through environmental conditions could degrade such a sample?
Yes.
And how about insect activity as well? No, we're talking about the tissue from the jawbone.
The objection is overruled.
You can answer that.
Okay, can you repeat it? Sorry.
Yeah, would that also include insect activity? Would that affect tissue sample?
Yeah, so potentially the insect activity could be a sign or part of the degradation process or decomposition process. And also, again, they could be consuming some of the sample that we're testing for.
Okay. And then you mentioned the decomposition process. Would the decomposition process as well affect your ability to obtain the profile?
Yes, it would.
And is that based on your training experience and your education in this field?
Yes.
Okay, if you can please have a seat, we're going to go to the next. And I'm referring to your report dated September 9, 2015. tell us what items you would have received on May 7th of 2014 from evidence custodian Ivy Lee?
So on May 7th, 2014, I received black jeans, which were a Perry Ellis brand, a gray sweater or sweatshirt, and a black bra.
And with respect to the black jeans, were you able to conduct DNA testing on that?
Yes.
And can you describe what testing was, what testing on what portion of those jeans were conducted?
So I'm referring to page 3 of the report dated September 9th, 2015. So I tested 3 samples on the jeans. The first sample I tested was a portion of the waistband, and then I tested 2 stains that were on the jeans also.
And then can you just tell us how did you go, well, first of all, how did you go about testing a sample from the waistband?
So to test the waistband, the way I sampled it was, we have a laboratory vacuum. It's a very small vacuum. It's not what you would envision as a day-to-day vacuum. It's actually, the vacuum is just a suction device. There's a length of tubing that's attached to it. At the end of the tubing, we have an attachment where a swab can fit in. So we'll vacuum an area. In this case, it would be the waistband, the clothing. So we're trying to pull up any of the cells that may be present. And it would be, what we'd be interested in from the waistband is contact, potential user DNA.
And when you say the cells that may have, I guess, been on the waistband, is this from, when you say cells, is this from just the, I guess, the contact between the waistband and the human skin?
Yes.
And you said you also tested 2 stained areas?
Yes, 2 stains were tested also.
And do you, when you test the stain areas, how do you mark it?
So normally on the item itself, we have stickers that we'll place near the location that we're
These are
sampling.
the little white stickers.
Yeah, there's small white stickers that include information, including the case number and the unique identifier and the date.
And what were the results of that?
Okay, so in regards to the waistband, a partial DNA profile consistent with a mixture of 2 or more individuals was obtained from the sample. And when I made the comparisons, due to low levels of DNA, no conclusions were made regarding Carly Scott and Stephen Capobianco as possible contributors to the partial DNA mixture. So basically it's an inconclusive result because of the low levels of DNA that were obtained from that sample.
Okay. And is that reflected in your tables, or the table that you prepared under State's Exhibit 435 that we just saw earlier?
Yes.
And again, we're referring to the table, I guess assist you in explaining the results of the other 2 items that we're going to go into.
Yes.
やるべきですか、かしもすとかのこしまなり。
Yes.
I'm showing you that the table from your report dated September 9th, 2015. And again, these would have been the items of evidence that you received on May 7th, 2014. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So can you describe the description of the first item, the black jeans Perio's brand?
Okay, so again, we have the description here, which is the black jeans Perio's brand. We have our control number, which is our unique identifier. Then we have here the samples that were tested. So Q1, the sample that was designated as Q1 under this unique identifier and control number was the waistband. There's NA here for blood because no blood testing was done. The DNA results are summarized here. where there was a partial mixture consistent with 2 or more individuals obtained. And due to low levels of DNA, no conclusions were made regarding Carly Scott and Stephen Capobianco. The other 2 samples that were tested were designated as Q2 and Q3 under this control number, and no blood was detected and no DNA testing was done on those samples.
Now, Ms. Kashimoto, when you took the samples from the black jeans, there are 2 stains. One is marked as Q2 and the other is marked as Q3. Were they stains visible to the naked eye?
Yeah, so when I do my screening, if I'm looking for blood-like stains, there has to be something visible. So it could be anything that's brownish to reddish. So it's still a question to me whether or not it's a blood-like sample or a blood sample. So therefore, I do the preliminary test of doing the blood testing on those samples, and that would determine, normally that would determine whether or not I would take it through DNA.
Okay. So in this case, did you perform both blood tests, one to detect the presence of blood, the other to detect whether it's of human origin?
Yes, so the 2 tests that we utilized for blood testing were performed on those samples.
And according to the table, no blood was detected, is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, because no blood was detected, did you proceed further?
No further testing was done on those 2 samples.
Based on your training, experience, as well as education in this field, are there reasons why something that would appear to have a blood-like stain would have or would not test or show up in the blood test that you described earlier?
Objection, Your Honor, ask an answer. We got the general information about why this came here already twice now.
The objection is overruled.
Please answer that.
Okay, so again, if we're testing for a specific substance, in this case blood, the possible reasons for a negative result are, number 1, that substance isn't present. So if I'm testing for blood, it's possible that no blood was there, so my test didn't detect any. Another reason is that it's at a low level, and such a low level that the kits I utilize aren't sensitive enough to pick up the results. And that would include if the substance was degraded due to environmental conditions. I wouldn't expect necessarily to be able to obtain a result.
And so, if an item that had blood-like stains, a clothing item that had blood-like stains, were found in water or in a running river, would that be one of the conditions that would affect your ability to obtain a profile? Oh, I'm sorry, to I guess, register on the blood test.
So if the assumption is that there was blood present and the item was recovered in a running river, I would expect there to be an effect. Number 1, just the fact that it's in water is potentially diluting a sample. And also, it's going to aid in the degradation or deterioration of that sample.
Now, according to the table, you also tested the gray sweater, is that correct?
Yes.
And can you tell us how you went about testing that?
Okay, so, sorry, let me just review this for a moment. Okay, so I examined the item described as a gray sweater. I took cuttings of 5 different stains. I tested that for blood. It's right here. So these 5 stains were tested for blood. No blood was detected. So those, I didn't do any further testing on these 5 samples. But what I also did was I sampled the item for potential wearer or user DNA. That's indicated here with the Q6, and the areas I sampled were the collar, the armpit, and the cuff. I didn't do any blood testing on that. The sample was taken through DNA testing. My results were that a partial DNA profile consistent with 2 individuals was obtained from that sample, and Carly Scott and Stephen Capobianco were excluded as contributors to that sample.
So Ms. Kashimoto, with respect to the gray sweater, Q1 through 5, those weren't swabs, you said those were cuttings, is that correct?
Normally, for blood-like samples, I'll take a cutting.
And what, can you tell us what is a cutting?
So cutting is, well, I'll actually take sterilized scissors, and I'll cut out a small portion of that stain and take it through our blood testing.
And when you tested for, and when you say blood testing, you did apply both of the tests that you described earlier?
Yes, both tests are always applied when we do our blood testing.
And there was no blood detected, is that correct?
No blood was detected on those 5 stains.
And did you proceed further after that?
No further testing was done on those 5 stains.
Now, Q6 on the gray sweater, that is indicated that was taken from the collar, the armpit, and the cuff, is that correct?
That's correct.
So are those swabs?
So that would have been the vacuuming. So
Oh, I'm sorry, vacuum.
it would have been a vacuuming where I'm trying to pull off any cells that are in that area.
And because they weren't stains, you did not apply the 2 blood tests.
Correct. I wasn't testing them for any kind of stain. I was just trying to see if there was any DNA present from a possible user or wearer.
And then when your result is there's a partial DNA sample consistent with 2 individuals, how were you able to determine that?
So, as I mentioned before, one of the important facts about DNA is that it's inherited from our parents, half from our mom, half from our dad. So the expectation for a single source profile is you're going to have 1 or 2 genetic characteristics at any given location that we examine. So the way we determine that it's a mixture is right off the bat, if we see more than 2 genetic characteristics, we know that there's more than 1 contributor.
Okay, and is that why you list consistent with 2 individuals?
Yes,
And then you did conclude Carly Scott and Stephen Capobianco are both excluded from it.
that is correct.
And how did you reach that conclusion?
So again, at the end of our testing, we have the DNA profiles. We make a comparison to the unknown or the question sample, to any reference or known samples that we have tested, and we determine if we can make an association. So after evaluating or comparing 2 reference samples that I had to that unknown profile, my conclusion was that they were both excluded.
Now, the third item that you would have received on February 7th, 2014 would be the black bra, is that correct?
That's correct.
And can you tell us how did you go about testing for that item?
Okay, so for this one, what I did was I took a swabbing of the left cup and also the right cup. So that those are designated as Q1 and Q2 under this control number here.
And are they, it's noted that both are the anterior portion, is that correct?
Yes. And then those samples I tested for blood, and my results were that no blood was detected from either of those samples that I took from the interior cups of the bra.
Mhm.
I did proceed to take it through DNA, however, and there was no DNA profiles obtained from either of those samples. There was a third sample that I took, so it's designated as Q3, and what I did was I vacuumed the cups, the back straps, and the shoulder straps. So again, sampling that was in order to see if I could pick up any user or contact DNA. So there was no blood testing done on that sample. And my results were there was no interpretable DNA profile obtained. Again, so that's a low-level profile, maybe 1 or a few genetic characteristics are showing, but I can't do anything with it.
Now, Ms. Kashimoto, with respect to Q1 and Q2 for the back bra, I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I heard this. Was that swabs or was that vacuuming?
Q1 and Q2 were swabs, swabbing of the cups, and that was to see if there was any blood on the interior cups.
And did you just swab the interior in general, or did you focus on the stain if you saw any?
I don't think I saw any stains, so that's why I did a general swabbing.
Okay. And then Q6, I think you mentioned that was through vacuum?
So this is...
I'm sorry, not Q6, Q3.
Q3 would have been a vacuuming.
And you did try to, I guess, get a DNA profile for both Q1 and Q2 as well as Q3.
Yeah, so all those samples were taken through DNA.
And you weren't able to obtain any, I guess, for Q1 and Q2, there are no DNA profile obtained.
Correct.
And the third one, Q3, you did obtain something, but it was, I guess, too low or not enough.
Too low and not enough to make any comparisons with.
Okay, I'm gonna go to the next page. That's in Exhibit 435. Yeah, just a second. It seems like our trial pad froze. Okay, go to page 2 of that exhibit. Just briefly, you already testified about the buccal swabs that was recovered, or that was submitted and recovered from a Stephen Capobianco as a reference sample, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Going to the first item that you received on July 7th, 2015, the blue jeans, the DKNY brand. Did you conduct testing, DNA testing on that?
Yes, I did.
And can you describe what testing you conducted?
Okay, so for the blue jeans, DKNY brand, the first sample I tested designated as Q1 was I vacuumed a sample or an area of the waistband. I didn't do any blood testing. I took it through DNA, and my results were that there was a mixture consistent with 2 or more individuals, and that Carly Scott and Stephen Capobianco cannot be excluded as possible contributors.
And now, Ms. Kashimoto, before we get into the frequency estimate, how were you able to determine that Carly Scott and Stephen Capobianco could not be excluded as possible contributors to the waistband, I guess, sample that you recovered?
So again, after I obtained the profile, the question sample profile, which is the waistband sample from the blue jeans of the DKNY brand jeans, I made a comparison against the 2 reference samples that I had. So at each genetic location, I'm examining it to see if there's any consistencies between the known or the reference sample that I'm examining to the question sample. So I do that at each of the 15 genetic locations. And because there was an association, or I should say concordance at each of the genetic locations for each of the individuals, they could not be excluded from that sample.
And I guess when you, not I guess, but when you determine that something or a comparison cannot be excluded, then you would run a frequency estimate to that?
Yes,
And in this case, the frequency estimate you have listed there is 185, is that correct?
yes.
And then you have multiple, I guess, asterisks after that. Okay, could you explain that for us?
Okay, so in regards to frequency estimates, I mentioned that the reason why we do it is because we want to provide weight to any kind of conclusion we make. So what do these numbers mean? Well, it's going to tell us how common or rare any given profile is. A very large number is indicating that it's a rare profile. A low number is indicating it's common, or there could be many people that could have contributed to that sample.
So in this instance, looking at that number, that would be, I mean, based on your description, that would be more common and not rare.
Yes,
Although that number would be more common, you would not be able to exclude Carly Scott or Stephen Capobianco based on their reference samples?
that's correct. So
Objection, reading and argument.
The objection is sustained.
Move to strike the motion.
Granted.
Based on the frequency estimate being common, 185, just based on that number alone, would you be able to exclude Carly Scott or Stephen Capobianco?
Objection, reading has been answered.
No, that was-
The objection is sustained. You may rephrase.
When a number is low as 185, would you be able to exclude in the known or reference samples based on the number alone?
Objection, reading.
You know, that's, I'm not suggesting an answer to an expert who's has the training, expertise, as well as knowledge.
I'm going to sustain the objection. I think all you have to do is rephrase the question.
With respect to Carly Scott and Stephen Capobianco, what if anything, does the frequency estimate of 185 mean to you?
okay, so our evaluation, our comparisons are done prior to the calculation of the frequency estimate. So I'm still comparing a known sample to a question sample. I'm coming up with a conclusion just based on the DNA profiles. At that point, I need to provide weight to what my conclusion is. So that's where the frequency estimates come into play, when they're calculated and reported. So in this case, the frequency estimate was 185, which is a low number. So the frequency estimate doesn't change my conclusion. So my conclusion still remains that the two cannot be excluded. It's just that the weight is not strong.
Okay, and after you conducted DNA testing on a sample from the waistband, did you conduct further testing of the blue genes?
Yes.
And can you tell us what that was?
So the additional testing I did on the genes was, there was actually 2 stains that I sampled. And I sampled them 2 different ways. Because potentially blue genes can interfere with some of our testing, I wanted to make sure that I sampled it in different ways just in case there was an issue. So the first thing I did was I actually swabbed the stain. So that was one sample. So over here, this Q2 is indicating the stain that was swabbed. And then I actually took a cutting also of that same area of the stain. And so I tested that for 2 different stains, and my results are listed here. So for Q2, the one that I swabbed, there was a partial DNA profile obtained, and Carly Scott could not be excluded. There's a frequency estimate listed, but in addition, I had also tested, again, the same stain, but this time I took a cutting. I got a little bit better result for Q3. So the DNA profile obtained matched the DNA profile of Carly Scott, and the frequency estimate is listed here. And then I should say for both Q2 and Q3, Stephen Capobianco was excluded. So what we'll do is we'll make comparisons against any reference samples that we have tested, and we'll make comparisons and conclusions. I did the same thing for another stain. So again, there's Q4 and Q5 here. Q4 is indicating the swabbing that was taken from that stain, and Q5 is indicating the cutting that was taken in that area of the stain. I forgot to mention that human blood was indicated on both of the stains, all the samples tested. Q4, the DNA profile obtained matched Carly Scott. There's a frequency estimate listed. I had the same results for the cutting. So the DNA profile obtained matched Carly Scott.
Okay. With respect to Q2 and Q3, starting with Q2, well, you testified earlier that I guess in order for there to be a match, you would look at whether the source of the stain in this case is a single source, or if it's a mixture, it would be the major contributor. Is that correct?
That's correct.
In this case, with respect to Q2, Q3, Q4, Q5 of the blue jeans, the DKNY brand, was that single source or mixture?
Those were single source profiles.
And when you say single source, that comes from what?
It indicates that it's coming from one individual.
And you're able to find the individual. You did test those stains, or you did compare those stains with, I guess, the DNA profile that you had received from the toothbrush designated as Charlie Scott's toothbrush?
Yes, so comparisons were made against the two reference samples that I have.
And the other one would have been from the buccal swabs from Stephen Capobianco.
That's correct.
And when you say the frequency estimate, let's start with Q2. The frequency estimate was 29.58 trillion. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And can you just tell us, well, what does that mean? 29.58 trillion.
Okay, so 29.5 trillion is a very large number. So again, the frequency estimate is done to provide weight to our conclusion. So that large number is indicating strong support for the conclusion.
And then you said, though, in Q2, Carly Scott could not be excluded. Is that correct?
So for Q2, it cannot be excluded.
And out of the 15 locations with the DNA markers, do you recall how many locations?
I don't recall. All I remember is that it was a partial DNA profile.
Okay. And then moving to Q3, you determined that to be the profile to be a match, that stain to be a match with Carly Scott, and that's a cutting. Is that correct?
So Q3 was a cutting from that stain. Yes.
And then the frequency estimate, can you tell us what that was?
So the frequency estimate was 315.8 quadrillion.
And then when that was for Carly Scott, and when you tested that or compared that with Stephen Capobianco, he's excluded.
So Stephen Capobianco was excluded.
Now going to Q4, that was the swabbing from the blue jeans, is that correct?
Q4, yes, was a swabbing.
And what was that frequency estimate?
So it's the same as the one I just said. It's 315.8 quadrillion.
And then the cutting on Q5, what was the frequency estimate to Carly Scott? Frequency estimate.
Yeah, so the frequency estimate for that profile was 315.8 quadrillion as well.
And what does that number tell you, 315.8 quadrillion, on those two stains?
So that's a large number, so it's indicating strong support for the conclusion.
we'll take our lunch recess at this time and reconvene at 1:30. Thank you.
Court is in recess.